All right. So just a couple of quick reminders for you for this week. So we have an exam on Wednesday. It's going to be great. You're all going to do a great job. And I am going to do a study session on Tuesday. We're going to do that at about 6:30. And so I think that's going to go pretty well too. I am recording this, so this way, if you want to get last minute information, you can at least rewind this and watch this. Yeah. I always email you the link on YouTube. And if you follow my YouTube channel, so you actually just search for my name, you follow me on YouTube, you can find old lectures and all kinds of stuff. Like I have lectures from like 2 years back. So you know, if you want additional coverage or if you want me to repeat something or something like that, usually you can find it online. Yeah. Oh, it's just Amanda Gilchrist. Look for Amanda Gilchrist on YouTube. You'll find me. And so I was going to say, we're going to do our study session tomorrow night at 6:30 in the student lounge. And if you cannot make it, I will also be recording that. So that should be pretty good too. You will have a quiz that we'll post on Friday, but no forum this week. And if you didn't get in your forum for this past week, which was technically due Friday night, I have had a couple of stragglers. I will count them. But if you have forgotten to do forum number 6, go ahead and get that to me by tonight, please. Thank you. All right. Forum number 6 was about your study habits and stuff. So if you haven't gotten it in, I haven't graded everything yet because I was pretty swamped with the cemetery tour last week, but I am going to work on that right after class. Okay. So the last time that we were here, we were starting to talk about different aspects related to memory. And today we are going to talk about how memories are built. So how are we encoding information so that it gets into our long-term memory so that we can use it for later, such as for a test, for example. So I hate to break it to you, but memory is one of those things where if you want to remember something for later, you actually have to study information. So we're going to talk a little bit about the work of Hermann Ebbinghaus. So Hermann Ebbinghaus actually did a lot of research on memory back in the 1800s before psychology was even an established field. And what's really kind of interesting about Ebbinghaus is that he did a lot of this research on himself. You generally are not going to find a lot of experiments these days where the researchers are experimenting on themselves. And so what he would do was he would learn these long lists of nonsense syllables. So the syllables were made up of a consonant, a vowel, and a consonant, one that didn't make a word. So for example, TOJ, that is what we call a nonsense syllable, or sometimes it's called a CVC, consonant, vowel, consonant. Can you imagine learning really long lists of these all day long? Yeah, because that's basically what Ebbinghaus did. So depending on the list that he was studying, he would either learn a list 8 times, 16 times, 24 times, 32 times, 42 times, 53 times, all the way up to 64 times. I can think of so many better uses of my time. But here's what's really interesting. So after repeating them for a certain number of times on day 1, he would check and see how his memory was on day 2. He would see how long it took him to relearn those list items perfectly. And what we end up seeing is that the more that you repeat something, the more that Ebbinghaus repeated a list, the better his memory was because it took him less time to relearn it. So this is what is called the total time hypothesis. The more that you study something, the better your memory for it is going to be. So yeah, don't just put a textbook under your pillow. It's not going to work. Oh, I know. By the way, sleep tapes don't work either. I'm just here crushing all of your dreams. I'm sorry. Okay, so here's another study tip for you. How many of you like to cram? Or maybe it's not that you don't like to, but you do it anyway. How many of you have crammed? Raise your hand, don't be shy. We are a place of no judgment. Have you ever crammed for any test? How many of you crammed for the last test in this class? Oh, I can't believe you. No, I'm kidding. No judgment. So I understand that the reality of college is that sometimes you have to cram. Everything okay back there? Okay. So one of the things that we know is that in general, and many of you can relate to this experience, I'm sure, because y'all, even I crammed in college. I know you're shocked. I've done it too. But how many of you have had this experience where you cram for a test, you go in to take the test, you do really well, and then as if almost by magic, all of the information just magically leaves your head as soon as you leave the room. That is also incredibly common when you cram. Now, another name for cramming, and I'm going to go ahead and put this on annotate. It is one of the perks of recording this. Another name for cramming is called mass practice. So when you engage in mass practice, you are basically doing all of your studying in one giant mass. And here's what we know about mass practice. It works over the short term. It does not work over the long term. So if you're in a class where information builds on each other, like in a science class or in a math class, cramming is not going to help you with that cumulative information. Now, so it'll help you over the short term, but over a longer period of time, cramming doesn't really help. So one of the things that I recommend that you do, wait, we got to clear the annotations. So one of the things that I actually recommend that you do is something that is called spaced practice. You break your studying up into sections and you do a little bit at a time, and you make sure to take breaks. So one of the things that I often recommend, especially if you didn't do very well on the first test, so people come and talk to me and I say, well, when did you start looking at the study guide? And people go, the night before. That's mass practice. What I recommend, and I would recommend this all the time. So I tend to post the study guide the week before the test, and generally I try to post it a little earlier if I can. What I recommend is that you just do a little bit each day. So it's not overwhelming you. You only have to do maybe 20 minutes at a time instead of 3 full hours the night before the test. But by doing a little bit each day, you're giving yourself an opportunity to build those memories. And we do actually find that not only does mass practice work over the short, or space practice work over the short term, unlike mass practice, it works over the long term as well. So if you're in a class with a cumulative final, you might want to engage in spaced practice because you're going to have better retention of that information over a long period of time. So this is what's referred to as the spacing effect. So spacing out your studying actually produces better long-term memory performance over time. Additionally, how many of you like tests? I know how many of you hate tests? That's cool. I do too. That's why I became a professor, so I don't have to take them anymore. I just give them. That's not actually true. That's a silly reason to become a professor. But in general, we know that the more often that you test yourself, the better your memory for this information is going to be. That's why I let you retake quizzes as many times as you want before the deadline, so that you have an opportunity to test yourself, because we do actually know that repeated testing of studied material actually produces better learning than just studying. Testing yourself helps too. And in fact, it often works better over the long term. So those are a couple of study tips for you. And folks, I wouldn't be telling you these if we didn't have actual research to back them up. Okay. So one thing that I kind of talked about on Friday when we talked about memory is that many times when I give you a list of words, you are going to remember the first items in a list and the last items in the list better than you'll remember the middle of the list. So I want you, so we kind of looked through the list of words that I gave you on Wednesday. And we found that a good chunk of you remembered the items at the beginning of the list pretty well. So what you're kind of seeing here, I want you to focus on the line in red. So this right here is what is called a primacy effect. This is basically the finding that we remember the first items of the list better. Now, part of the reason that you remember the first items in a list very well is because you get an opportunity to repeat those to yourself. So, for example, I believe that some of the first words on the list were sugar, heart, tooth, and tart. So when I started saying words, I bet a lot of you did something like this. So I give you the word sugar and you'd go sugar, sugar, sugar. Then I'd give you sugar and then heart and you'd go sugar, heart, sugar, heart. And then you go, and then I give you tooth and you go sugar, heart, tooth, sugar, heart, tooth. For a lot of you, is this how you remember lists? Now, what happens if we start to get too many words? It's almost like when you're rehearsing items like that to yourself, it's almost like you're juggling. What happens when there's too many things to juggle? What do most of you do? You throw them all up in the air and you go, okay, I'm not going to rehearse anymore. I'm just going to listen. And we do actually find that when you're learning a list, when there are too many items to rehearse, most people stop rehearsing and they just focus on listening. So here's what's really interesting. That primacy, because you repeated those items, guess where they are? Are they in short-term memory or are they in long-term memory? They're in long-term. On the other hand, when you start listening and you no longer rehearse, you are entirely operating on short-term memory. And so what we find is that for a lot of people, the last items in a list are also recalled very well. And this is what is called a recency effect. So items at the end of the list are recalled very well. Now, these are due to completely different things. Primacy is due to rehearsing the first few items and those getting into long-term memory. Remembering the last few items of a list, that recency effect, is totally because of short-term memory. Those are the last items that you were able to grab. And here's what's really interesting. I want you to imagine that I gave you that list of words and then I made you do math problems for about 30 seconds. You're like, gross. But you know what will happen? So I give you that list, I give you math problems for 30 seconds, and then I ask you to recall them. Here's what we find. This is what's called delayed recall. You still have primacy because those first few items are still in long-term memory, but we completely knock out recency, because recency is based on short-term memory. And if I give you math problems, that information in short-term memory, those last few list items are going to be lost.
Is that what this graph displays?
That is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. So no.
It just says rapid decay with no rehearsal.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the things that we do find is that in general with forgetting, you will lose a majority of the information that you study within the first hour of learning it. Yeah, I know. Isn't that depressing? It is a little bit. Okay.
You have to learn everything. Opportunity.
Well, speaking of learning things, it turns out that when we talk about long-term memory, we have different types of memory for things that we do. And folks, I'm really proud of this slide. I've been using this for 10 years and it's a Monty Python and the Holy Grail reference. Okay, so I want you to imagine that you are on a quest for the Holy Grail and you've got your whole gang of people behind you clicking coconuts to mimic the sound of horses' hooves, and you're doing this. Yes, we got it. So you go to see a bridge keeper and you have to cross this bridge, but the bridge keeper will not let you cross the bridge unless you answer these questions 3. So he's going to give you the first question. He's going to say, what is the capital of Assyria? Which is actually a question that he asks in the movie. Now, the correct answer to this is Assur. I had to look this up. But let's say we already know the answer. So folks, this is a memory for a fact, correct? This is a fact. Likewise, what is your favorite color is also a fact. So when we have a memory for a fact or general knowledge or language, that is called semantic memory. Anything that can be a trivial pursuit question is semantic memory. What is your name is semantic memory. What is 2 + 2 is semantic memory. And linguistics, like language, all of that is semantic memory. Now, here's something kind of cool about semantic memory. So folks, what is 2 + 2? Thank you for saying 4 and not being smart and saying something like 5. I would get annoyed. But here's my question to you. How many of you remember the first place that you learned that? Almost none of us do. Now, if you do, that is totally fine. But what we find is for a lot of facts that we repeat over and over, we don't actually remember where we first learned them. We demonstrate that we have this memory by giving the answer. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and say that we got this question right. So next, the bridge keeper is going to ask us a new question. What did you have for breakfast yesterday? Now, this is different than a memory for a fact. This is a memory that you can consciously search in your mind and get the answer and report it. So this is remembering an event in time. This is called episodic memory. So here's an important distinction between episodic memory and semantic memory. So if I want to remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, I have to go back consciously searching for that information and I can find the memory. And folks, like, it's kind of trivial. Obviously, what you had for breakfast yesterday is pretty trivial. Nobody really cares that I had Texas toast with peanut butter. There we go. So in this particular case, we have a source memory. We know where this came from. In the case of semantic memory, we often don't have a source for that. And if you're curious, we talk about that a little bit more in cognitive psych and why there might be a difference between the two. Now, we do have a special type of episodic memory that is called autobiographical memory. Now, most of your episodic memories are going to be pretty trivial. So for example, you might remember what happened during the last exam. That is generally going to be a pretty trivial event. And I bet if I asked you, do you remember what you were doing the first exam in this class? If I asked you that 5 years from now, you're not going to remember that. You probably won't. But you have some important memories that are structured around your life narrative, that are important to your life story. And these are what are called autobiographical memory. So you graduating high school might be a really important event. Me getting my PhD, pretty important life event. And we're not necessarily just talking about the big stuff. We can also talk about, for example, where you were during the 2020 pandemic. So when all of this information went down in March of 2020, you can think about where you were and probably have a pretty vivid memory of where you were when everything started kind of shutting down. Now, episodic memory is sometimes referred to as mental time travel. For us to search for these events, we have to go backwards in time in our mind. And at least as far as we know right now, We are the only creatures that can do this. Now, the more that we learn about animals, the more that we learn that they're capable of far more than we give them credit for. So it's possible that with time, we may find we're not the only ones that do this. Yeah.
I'm still a little confused about the autobiographical memories.
So episodic memories for trivial stuff. So like, what did you do this weekend is probably going to be pretty trivial. Autobiographical memories are big, important memories that are all about your life story. Generally speaking, the fate of your life does not hinge on what you had for breakfast yesterday. On the other hand, your life narrative may hinge on big, important events, such as your first job or your first relationship or things like that. Does that kind of make sense? So episodic memories are trivial. Autobiographical memories are important to you. Okay, so finally, we've answered both of these questions. We're doing great. We get the third question: how do you ride a bicycle? And at this point, we are going to be thrown off the bridge. And here's why. We demonstrate that we have a memory of riding a bike by doing it, not by telling people about it. I mean, let's be clear. You can tell people some basic stuff. You're like, okay, I put my hands on the handlebars and I put my feet on the pedals and I try to balance and I move my feet this way. But guess what? All of this involves a lot of muscle memory, a lot of movement. It is a skill. It is one thing to talk about doing a skill, and it is another to actually do it. And oftentimes we're going to find that we demonstrate our skills by performing them, not by telling people how to perform them. So at this point, we're going to be thrown off the bridge. So remembering how to do things is procedural memory. So that includes things like skills, like how to make a peanut butter sandwich. That includes things like knowing how to swim. Fun fact, I don't. I grew up in Florida. I do not know how to swim. I actually hate the water. I love baths. I hate the water. You would too if every time you went in the ocean, you got salt water up your nose. It's unpleasant. Okay. So yeah, I like this slide. It does a really good job of explaining the different types of memory. So we can make a distinction between these three different types of memories. So we had our semantic and our episodic, and then we have our procedural. So we can call these explicit memories versus implicit memories. So explicit memories, another word for them is declarative memory. We demonstrate that we have these memories by telling people about them. So explicit memory requires conscious awareness. So both semantic and episodic memory are explicit memories. For you to find the answer, you have to consciously search your mind for it and report it by telling somebody. Now, here's what's really important. We haven't really talked about a lot of brain areas yet, but the hippocampus is going to be critical for this. The hippocampus is basically responsible for converting short-term memory into explicit memory. So to be really clear, the hippocampus is critical for explicit memories. So for a lot of people that have amnesia due to damage to the hippocampus, what we are going to find is that if they meet you and they know you give them your name, if you see them a few hours later, they will not be able to remember it. Knowing your name and knowing that they met you are declarative memories, and the hippocampus has been damaged and it's not able to create those explicit memories. So when it comes to explicit memories, when you have damage to the hippocampus, you are basically only operating on short-term memory. Now, on the other hand, implicit memories do not require conscious awareness. So we demonstrate that we have these memories by doing things or behavioral change. And these do not require conscious awareness for us to do them. When I get in the car and I go for a drive and I go through the steps of getting in the seat, buckling my seatbelt, putting my key in the ignition, adjusting my mirrors, and turning the gear shift, all of those cases, I don't have to think very much about them, and I don't consciously have to retrieve what I'm supposed to do. I do those automatically because they are skills. So procedural memory does not require conscious awareness, and the hippocampus is not needed to learn new skills. A lot of these things are going to take place in areas like the cerebellum and other parts of the brain. And those aren't damaged in people with amnesia. So what we actually find is that people who have hippocampal damage can actually learn new skills because those do not require a hippocampus. So here's what's really cool. I can give somebody with amnesia a puzzle and have them solve it. And then I bring them in the next day to solve that same puzzle. Now, here's my question. Will they get better at the puzzle from day 1 to day 2? Yes, that's a skill. However, will they remember doing the puzzle? No, they will think it's the first time that they've done it because remembering that you did a puzzle is an explicit memory. Actually solving the puzzle is a procedural memory. So they'll get better, but they'll say they've never done it before. Everybody good here? Okay. Oh, yeah.
I was gonna make the joke that we could use the reference 10-second when we cross dates.
I was gonna say, so 51st dates doesn't actually work like how it's, your memory doesn't reset at the end of every day. That's not how it works.
No,
But 10-second Tom, yeah, 10-second Tom is probably a lot more like what somebody with amnesia actually looks like. Or Dory from Finding Nemo. Mm-hmm.
How much of this was discovered with patient HM?
A good chunk of this was actually discovered through HM. And if we have time, we'll talk about it. If not, I will point out other lectures where I do talk about it so that you can watch those. So one of the other things that we know about memory is that if we want to try to remember something for later, we need to try to make it meaningful. So interestingly enough, if you have a fight with a friend, you are probably not going to remember the exact phrasing of everything that they said unless it really stood out to you or it was really, really hurtful. What's interesting is that in general, we tend to remember the overall gist of information over specific phrasing. But what we remember does depend on our context that we are in, and it also depends on our experience. So I'm going to read you a passage. And I want you to think about whether or not you would be able to remember this if I tested you on it later. So I'm going to read this to you. If you've read ahead in your textbook, don't spoil for anybody that hasn't done this yet. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. All right. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important to not overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem complicated or important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, that is part of life. So if I asked you to remember that information, who's going to do a really bad job of that? Yeah, why would you have trouble remembering that? It's a lot and it's really vague, right? We're talking about some weird procedure and doing too much and not enough. However, if I told you ahead of time that the passage was titled Washing Clothes, would you have had an easier time remembering it? We find, so Bransford and Johnson back in 1972 gave a bunch of people that passage. And depending on the circumstances, they either got the washing clothes title initially, or they got it after the fact, after they read all of that. And in some cases, they didn't get it at all. And what we find is that the best memory performance happened for the group that got the washing clothes title first, because they had a context with which to structure and organize their memories of the passage. Now compare that to people who got that at the end. You get that really vague passage and then you're like, oh, it's washing clothes. Unfortunately, you haven't, because you got the title later, you're not able to structure that information around it as you were hearing it. So that makes it harder to remember. So context is really important. Yeah.
So did they find that if you got the title first, you had the best memory of the
Yes.
story? If you got the title after, you still performed better than no title?
Let me take a
Or
look.
Is it insignificant between those last two groups?
Let me see. Let's see. Okay. Generally, we actually find that the group that got the title at the end compared, when you compare them to a control condition that never got the title, they did equally poorly.
Interesting.
So it turns out that even getting the context after the fact doesn't really do much for your memory for that information. So it seems that the context is more critical as you're learning the information. It's a lot harder to structure it after the fact.
Thank
So
you.
imagery helps us too. So it's actually easier for us to remember information if we can visualize it. Researchers have given people lists of items that are very high imagery. So words like apple, bag, ball, all of those you can imagine in your mind. Now I want you to compare that to memory for words like freedom, peace, deconstructionism. All of those are very vague words and they're hard to come up with images. And researchers have actually found that words that are easy to visualize are going to be a lot easier for us to remember than words that are not. Do y'all like my new fuzzy sweater? I feel like a Muppet.
I like it. But now that you say you feel like a Muppet, I feel like
It's fuzzy and bright.
Yeah.
I'm a Muppet. Now I just need to shake my arms around like this and I'll really be a Muppet.
I feel like you could be a part of like the band Muppets.
Oh, the Electric Mayhem and Dr. Teeth. Animal played drums. Okay, that's my only Muppet imitation that you get today. Sorry.
Today.
Today.
That means there could be more.
I guess I have to come back to all the classes in the rest of the semester just in case I get another Muppet.
You're here every day. Okay. Okay. So one of the things that we find is that in general, emotion is going to make information a lot easier for us to remember. So you might remember when we were back in chapter 2, I talked about the notion of something called arousal. And arousal is basically having a heightened energy state. So we actually find that arousal that comes with emotions can actually create stronger and more reliable memories. Now, this can be helpful for us. Emotional events in our lives can be easier for us to remember, but it does kind of make things a bit of a double-edged sword. For many people, there are traumatic memories that have a lot of negative emotional connotations. And unfortunately, because of the way that our memory is structured, hey folks, just a friendly reminder, you've got the hippocampus, you know, it sits right in front of it, your amygdala. They are very interconnected, which means that emotional memories are going to be much stronger than ones that are not. And so if we are struggling with memories of trauma, those are cases where it would probably be best for us to forget this information, but we can't because of how the brain is structured. So the impact of emotion on memories is kind of a double-edged sword. Now, other instances of emotional memories are flashbulb memories. Folks, flashbulb memories are special types of autobiographical memories. So they're episodic memories. And oftentimes we are going to find that you have a very clear and vivid memory of a significant moment or an event. So when I first got to CAUTI, the first major flashbulb, I talked about the first major flashbulb memory that was a big deal to me, September 11th. And the older that I get, the more that I discover that many of you were not alive during September 11th, 2001. And to put this into perspective, I was a college freshman. I had been at FSU for 2 weeks when September 11th happened. And at least for somebody my age, we hadn't really been in a major war in a while. So to have something like that happen was very destabilizing. And I have a clear memory of where I was and what I did when I heard this information. Now, most of you were not alive during September 11th, but we all know where we were on March 2020 when everything shut down, right? It's almost like you're in a picture. It feels really clear and it feels really vivid, and everybody remembers where they were. I was at MU, so I was at the University of Missouri on spring break, preparing to start planning my sabbatical and asking my former advisors if they would help me with sabbatical. And while I was on campus, every email was campus closed, driving back. Everything shut down. We got a message from the president about flights in Europe, and it was just the whole world felt like it was falling apart. It was very weird. And I don't want to deny that the past 2 years have, in some ways for us, big and small. We can talk about trauma with a big T, or we can talk about trauma with a little t. And for a lot of you, that might have been something you've never experienced before. And if it helps, me neither. But I'm a millennial. I've been through a lot of crap already. So 9/11, big recession, lots of stuff. Okay. So I think it kind of goes without saying, memories are stored in the brain. I know, right? Shocking. You thought they were stored somewhere like the stomach, but you'd be wrong. So new memories actually begin with our neurons. So memory happens and memories begin to get stored because of a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP. I am not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but if you would like to learn more about LTP, or if you are a bio major or a health and biomedical sciences major, I am teaching biopsych next semester at 1:30 on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And we'll be talking all about this after the midterms, after spring break. So long-term potentiation basically what happens, so we have neurons that are connecting with each other at the synapse, that gap between our two neurons. We actually find that the neurons become better senders and receivers of information. They start to wire together and they start to form a network. So do y'all want to hear something that I always thought was really cool? And this is what really got me into cognition and neuroscience. Your brain becomes a brand new thing every time you learn something new. I like that idea very much. So the brain that you have right now is not the same brain that you had on Friday. There's little differences there. So in particular, long-term potentiation is the underlying basis for all learning and memory. We do see that there is increased serotonin that is released, and the dendrites and the axons grow new receptor sites so that they can increase the contact that they make with each other. And we also know that memory formation, just in case you weren't sure that memories aren't stored in the brain, we know that taking care of your head is really important for memory. When you get things like concussions, you get micro damage to the neurons in your brain. The neurons will twist and shear and cause damage. And researchers have actually found that head injuries hurt formation of long-term memories. So researchers would actually sit on a football field and they'd wait for somebody to get a head injury. And when somebody got a head injury, they would ask them immediately after the damage, what play were you executing when this happened? And initially, they are able to tell you. If you ask them 5 minutes later, they won't, because that brain damage hurts your ability to convert short-term information into long-term information. So yeah, protect your head. It's important. Also, I can't believe that we still have NFL or hockey. Even though I like hockey, I still can't believe it. Okay, so we've talked about how we build memories. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how we remember with the time that we have left. Now, I realize we're not going to have time to cover everything. So after class, I'm going to send you some links to some things that I have already recorded so that you can learn more. I would record it myself right now, but I don't have a lot of time this week. So I hope it's okay that I give you something that I previously recorded for another class. Yes.
These new recordings will not be on the test.
Huh?
Will the recordings that you're sending out today be on the test?
I would say don't worry about if it's on the study guide, it's on the test. So if the recording has something in the study guide, focus on that. If you want to skip past anything that's not on the test, go ahead. So yeah, focus on the study guide. The study guide will help you. So there are different ways that we can show that we've remembered something. So the first thing that we can do is a test of recall. So I give you a list of items and I ask you to tell me what items you remember. Pretty straightforward. Now, folks, what kind of test questions do we get that sound a lot like a recall? So remembering what you learned, but not necessarily being cued with anything. What kind of test questions do you get in this class that look like recall? Yeah, it's short answer. You have to consciously search through your mind and pull out what you remember. Now, on the other hand, recognition is if I give you a list of words and then I show you a word and I say, have you seen this before? Yes or no? So in this case, I give you an item and say, does this look familiar to you? Recognition is actually a more sensitive test. So can anybody think of what kind of test questions you get that are recognition tests?
Matching.
Matching could be one. What's another? Multiple choice. So the correct answer is in there. You just have to figure out which one is the most familiar to you. And then finally, we have relearning. So we don't actually have relearning on a test, but if I give you a puzzle and I see how long it takes you to solve it, and then I give you the puzzle the next day, it should take you less time to solve the puzzle on the second day if you have a memory of it. So we're trying to see if you get faster the next time that you relearn something. Okay. So one of the things that's helpful with memories is that oftentimes we are going to find that memories are held in storage by a web of associations. So how many of you have had this experience where you're thinking of something and you feel like it's on the tip of your tongue, but you're not able to remember it? And oftentimes what you will find is the right cue can help you remember. So if for example, I'm like, what's that thing that you do when you're grouping information together on the basis of knowledge? And I go, it starts with a C. That's a retrieval cue that you can use to help you remember. The answer is chunking, by the way. So here's what's really interesting. A retrieval cue is not just a word that you don't just need a word to help you or a memory to help you. Your environmental context can help you to remember. How many of you have heard of the idea that you should study in the same room that you're going to be tested in? That's because the context under which you study something can be used as a retrieval cue to help you. Likewise, how many of you have had the experience of going into another room to get something and then you forgot why you went there? This is famously referred to as the doorway problem, because when you go into a different room, you have changed your environmental context, and the environment is no longer a retrieval cue to help you remember. Often we find that by going back into the room you were in, you'll remember why you needed to go there. So what we find is that the best retrieval cues that we have are the ones that we form at encoding. How many of you have had the experience of losing? You need me to go back? Yeah. You don't need to write down the figure. It's just to show you an example. Oh, it's all right. So how many of you have had the experience of losing something? And what do people tell you when you try to find it again?
In the last place you look.
Yeah, you're going to try to go back and retrace your steps to go into the context that you were in when you last saw it. So again, we're trying to look for retrieval cues. So it's not just words that can help us, it's our environment as well. So what you're looking at here, this is what is called a context effect. So when learning and testing contexts match, your memory performance is going to be better. So they had a bunch of people either learn a list of words underwater or on land, and then they were tested underwater or on land. And the best memory performance it happens when the testing and the learning contexts match. When they mismatch, that's a lot harder for us to do. So returning to our previous context actually can serve as a retrieval cue to prime our memory. Sometimes it even triggers a sense of deja vu. Something feels familiar, but we don't have the sense that we have ever experienced it before. By the way, I also hate the phrase, it's always in the last place you look. And that's because you always find it.
It's not always in the last place you look.
If
If you get sidetracked, you can pick that sucker up and keep going.
that is true. And then I'm like, okay, I found this. Now what else do I need to find?
I was always told that when you stop looking for it, it'll show up. Because they're no longer putting all your
I'm helpful as well. You're just not looking for it actively anymore.
I know.
Okay, so we do have a couple of study guide questions related to forgetting. So since we didn't have time to cover that, I am going to send you some links to some stuff about forgetting. And again, if you want to fast forward through stuff and only focus on stuff that's on the study guide, that is okay. I am fine with that. We will have our review session tomorrow night at 6:30 in the student lounge. If you can't make it, I will be recording and I will make that available via a YouTube link. Have a great day. Get your forum in by tonight from like forum number 6. If you haven't done it yet, get it in. And I will see you all here for the exam on Wednesday. Bye. Have a good day.